Welcome to this Hudson Institute Virtual Forum, Thailand and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. I'm Ken Weinstein, Walter P. Stern Distinguished Fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Ambassador Michael George DeSombre to hear his reflections on this subject. In 1833, Thailand became America's first treaty ally in Asia, and the two countries have been strategic allies since 1954, conducting more than 400 military exercises annually. As a major non-NATO ally, Thailand is central to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and arguably to the U.S. Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. However, the Biden administration's Interim National Security Strategic Guideline omitted Thailand from its list of friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific. Is Thailand being overlooked by the Biden administration? What are the implications of this omission? I can't imagine a better individual to lead us in discussion today to reflect on this issue than Ambassador Michael George DeSombre. He was the first non-career U.S. ambassador in Thailand in more than 4 decades, confirmed for the position in January 2020, and he served until January 2021. He became an ambassador after a long and distinguished career as a top mergers and acquisitions lawyer in Asia with the U.S. law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. He was based in Hong Kong. He earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Stanford University, undergraduate in quantitative economics, his master's in East Asian studies, his JD from Harvard Law School. He speaks fluent Mandarin as well as Japanese and Korean, and I'm sure that we're all going to benefit from hearing his insights. Thank you very much, Ambassador DeSombre.
Ken, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here at the Hudson Institute and really say that it was the honor of my life to serve as the United States ambassador to the Kingdom of Thailand. As Ken mentioned, Thailand is the United States' oldest diplomatic treaty ally back to the 1833 Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which to this day still provides beneficial treatment for American companies in Thailand. The importance of Thailand in American foreign policy has gone up and down over the years. Obviously, for a long period from 1833 until the Vietnam War, perhaps was not as significant, became very significant at that period of time, and it has gone up and down. Right now, when you look at the importance of Thailand, you have to look at it within the strategic context in which we're operating. And what is that strategic context? Fundamentally, that strategic context is the US-China strategic competition. And this flows through all of the Indo-Pacific and is crucially relevant in Thailand. As we've seen in the last 6 to 8 years, China has been expanding its influence and power regionally and globally. And notwithstanding its protestations to the contrary, China is clearly pursuing regional hegemony in Asia. And this is the context when we need to look back at Thailand and the role that it has played and the role that it is playing and the role that it should play. It's important to review a little bit of the U.S.-Thai relationship. Ken alluded to the 1833 treaty, as well as the 1954 Manila Pact, which was originally the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which did not last, but is nonetheless still the foundation of the U.S. strategic relationship. I actually look at the strategic relationship beginning a bit earlier, quite honestly, and I spent a lot of time in Thailand working with the close people-to-people relationships that have existed at the strategic level for many years. You can actually date this back to World War II. Or you could even date it back to 1861 when King Mongkut offered President Lincoln some elephants to assist in the Civil War, but he didn't accept those and we didn't actually use them at that point in time. But in World War II, when Thailand acquiesced to Japanese control and declared war on the United States and Britain, this was not supported by the Thai people, and it wasn't supported by a lot of the Thai senior diplomats and military figures as well, who started up a resistance effort against Japan during World War II. This resistance effort included even the Thai ambassador to the United States not delivering the declarations of war to America, and America taking the position that it was not at war with the Thai people. It was only at war with Japan. And then there developed a resistance movement called the Seri Thai, or Free Thai movement in Thailand, that included Thai students in America that then wanted to be trained and returned to Thailand to participate in that resistance. William Donovan, leading the OSS, then supported that effort, and we supported the training of these students and actually helped repatriate them into Thailand and help connect them with the resistance. And I really trace the beginning of our strategic relationship to that. for a number of reasons. One, we really showed that we had Thailand's back. And this continued after World War II when Britain and France actually demanded reparations of Thailand. And Thailand resisted those demands, and America supported that resistance to the demands, and ultimately there were no reparations required out of Thailand. Even to this day, we hold an annual event in Thailand to celebrate the families of the Seri Thai. There is only one surviving member of the Seri Thai who I actually feted his family for specifically at my office in the embassy, and we hold this annual event to support the people. And it is that people-to-people relationship that actually makes the U.S.-Thai relationship at the strategic level so enduring. Military officers have been trained in the United States for decades. Thai military officers come to all of our service academies, other trainings. And U.S. military personnel participate in training in Thailand. My Army attaché when I was there had been to the Command Staff General College in Thailand, I think in around 1980, and actually happened to be there at the same time as the then Royal Thai Army commander. And so this created a very good relationship that is really emblematic of the nature of the person-to-person relationships that have existed over so long, particularly in the military and strategic area. But this strategic relationship has continued, and in 2012 was reaffirmed in a joint vision statement and then was reaffirmed again in 2020. But unfortunately, so much of what we do in Thailand is done at the operational level because it's been being done for so long that many senior government officials in the US and obviously the general American population doesn't appreciate the depth of that cooperation and the importance of that cooperation. And as Ken alluded to, back in 2019, before COVID, our last year of robust military engagements, we had over 400 military interactions, including over 14,000 US troops that were in and through Thailand at one point in time, 900 aircraft and 40 ships. Part of this was during the annual Cobra Gold military exercises, which is the largest multilateral military exercise in Asia. Unfortunately, COVID has slowed down some of that military interactions, but that was the common level of it. And again, that level of operation is something to think about because we don't have any bases in Thailand. We don't have a status of forces agreement in Thailand. And sometimes people like to contrast Thailand with the Philippines, where we have bases there, we have a SOFA. But I think the last couple of years have also shown that even the existence of bases and formal agreements doesn't mean permanency. And those agreements can be terminated, and the termination can be suspended, and then terminated again, and it's a very challenging circumstance. So when policymakers weigh the benefits of different allies, that's something that sometimes people look at Thailand and say, well, that we're not as strongly committed, we don't have bases there. But in actuality, the military interactions, joint operability, and everything else is very deep in Thailand. So why is Thailand of critical importance right now in the general US-China strategic competition? Thailand, in many respects, can be viewed as ground zero for this competition for influence and control. The Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy is focused on ASEAN centrality. Thailand is at the very center of mainland ASEAN. Mainland ASEAN is somewhat in degree the center of the Indo-Pacific if you go from India to Australia. And logistically, actually, is quite important for that purpose. But right now, you also have Thailand being surrounded by various influences from China that essentially are acting as a pincer movement around China. You look at what's going on in the South China Sea, which is increasingly being controlled by China, and they're trying to turn into their area, that excluding other countries. Then you have in Cambodia the purported agreement with China to take over and run a naval base in Ream, Cambodia, which is right on the Gulf of Thailand. It is of great concern for control and access into the Gulf of Thailand. You also have an extension of an airport in Dar es Salaam in Cambodia that appears intended to be able to operate military aircraft. And then you have client nation states like Laos that have really turned into a vassal state of China. China recently bought the electrical grid for all of Laos, rather disturbing development. And then Myanmar, which even before the coup was much more influenced by Belt and Road projects. You've got the Jiaopu port project on the Ottoman Sea that connects into Yunnan province for easy logistical aspects for China. And then you also have the special economic zones in Laos and Myanmar that essentially serve as hotbeds for criminal activity, much of it particularly in Myanmar involving drug production, methamphetamine production using Chinese provided precursor chemicals. All of this is happening right around Thailand in a way that makes Thailand very critical. We also have the circumstance of historical unfortunate series of events where after Xi Jinping became the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, had a first couple of years where people are cautiously optimistic he was going to be a political reformer, but by 2014, clearly that turned out not to be the case, and he started expanding influence, starting the Belt and Road Project, pushing influence and power out through Asia and the rest of the world. At that same time, you had a coup in Thailand that ultimately brought into power the current leaders. And unfortunately, during the Obama administration, you had a circumstance where there were certain legislative required things that had to be cut off at that point in time, including the military training that's been so critical towards our person-to-person relationship. But you just generally had a pushback where the Obama administration essentially pushed Thailand away at the same time as China was looking for opportunities to extend its influence. And so you had an unfortunate confluence of events where we were pushing them away, China was looking to get more involved, and you had a significant increase of Chinese involvement and influence in Thailand, including sales of certain military equipment, certain personnel carriers for the army, even 2 Chinese submarines, which is particularly interesting because the Gulf of Thailand is so shallow that one wonders about the value of submarines. But all of these were increasing ways of Chinese influence. So Thailand is very much sort of the ground zero where you have both US and China pushing for influence. And it's critically important that we make sure that we maintain our position there, maintain our access there, and maintain the ability to keep China from controlling Thailand. This effort, when I was ambassador, really focused not just on the strategic area, which I spent a lot of time on, but also on economic and other cultural interactions, because I'm a firm believer that the greater the connections between the countries, the closer we will be and the greater affinity we will have. And it's quite clear that Thailand people are very much have affinity for America because of the long history, because of saving them in World War II, because of defending them from reparations, defending them in the Vietnam War, and lots of other reasons, but culturally are very closely affiniated. One area that I started that hadn't been done before was a religious freedom roundtable. It's very interesting to note that back in 1878, King Chulalongkorn actually put forth an edict of religious tolerance on September 30, which was really way ahead of its time, and particularly at that point in time was one of the few countries, including the United States, that enshrined religious freedom in its constitution thereafter. And so I gathered a roundtable of the religious leaders of the 4 recognized religions, namely Buddhism, which represents about 93% of the population, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. And we basically had a very interesting roundtable, very instructive, talking about the history of religious freedom in Thailand, the present day, the future, and how Thailand could actually play a more proactive role in religious freedom globally, which again is an area that we have great affinity for with Thailand, while Thailand's neighbor to the north is obviously not as much in support of religious freedom. So these are different areas, but economically as well, it's critically important to get more economic involvement between the United States and Thailand. And during the post-coup period when the US was not engaging, US companies weren't engaging as much as well. So it's been an uphill battle to get more investment back into Thailand, to create those economic linkages and everything else. And all of that's really critical. But I mean, Ken, I think with that, we'll maybe have a discussion. And I think, it's really critically important that we try to do everything we can to make sure people understand the importance of Thailand and that we really, as a government, as a people, show Thailand that we still have their back and that we can be trusted.
Thank you for those enlightening remarks, really placing the U.S.-Thai relationship both in strategic as well as operational perspective. Let me ask you first and foremost, what did you find most intriguing about your service as ambassador to Thailand?
I mean, I hadn't appreciated before I went to Thailand how important the Thai embassy is and how much we do there. Thailand has been, and Bangkok has been, a regional hub for U.S. government and for lots of governments for many years. And so we have large amounts of seriously important work that, again, most people don't understand. One of them was critically important during this last year of the pandemic, in that I have not only the largest CDC operations outside the United States, we also have a large Armed Forces Research Institute of Medical Sciences, which is where every single malaria drug ever developed has actually been tested and developed. Having those health resources at my disposal, shall we say, with the onset of COVID, was particularly important. But generally the scope and size of all that we do there, that again, a lot of it is operational, just goes on, the cooperation is very deep, but it's not something that gets high profile, reporting. That was really surprising in a very pleasant way. And it really emphasized to me how important this regional position is. I mean, this regional location is.
The embassy is actually one of the largest we have.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, particularly as the wartime embassies of Baghdad and Kabul have gotten drawn down, I think Thailand is one of, if not the largest embassies nowadays.
Yeah, let me ask you, in terms of what you you sought to accomplish when you walked in, and your to-do list? What did you accomplish? What remains to be done? What did you check off the punch list?
Yeah, there's many things that are hopefully moving in the right direction, but hadn't been fully accomplished. My main two priorities, as I articulated them when I landed in my opening remarks and continually thereafter, was to energize the strategic relationship. So this is really, again, because we had this pause after 2014, I wanted to get our strategic relationship back up to the level it had been before, and hopefully even higher. And then secondly was to strengthen the economic partnership. And both of those I spent a lot of time on and had a lot of success on. I think that energizing the strategic relationship went very well during the 1 year that I was there, and I think we've set a lot of groundwork that will be continuing, including some initial sales of equipment, Stryker armored personnel carriers that we sold to them, the T-6 trainer aircraft, which is critical to being the next sort of generation of aircraft platforms that hopefully their Air Force will continue using. And so all of that sort of got back to the level it was before. I was pretty confident that was going very well. On the economic front, the time just wasn't quite sufficient to do as much as I wanted to do, but one of my signature policies that was further to Undersecretary of Economics Keith Croc's policies was the deal teams in country, which something I hadn't appreciated before was that I assumed that a large role of any embassy overseas was to help sort of promote American businesses and American economic interaction with the country and everything else. How wrong I was. The vast majority of people in country, even if they're, quote, dealing with economics, are not intended for that purpose. At least historically, we're not intended for that purpose. I mean, for example, the whole econ cone, as they call it in the State Department, I mean, the vast majority of its work is writing, congressionally mandated reports and just supplying information back to DC. But so with the sort of imprimatur of the Undersecretary's direction, I sort of redirected all of that and said, okay, we're all going to work together on doing whatever we can for economic diplomacy, trying to just increase our economic connections to, in this case, Thailand, because that's where I was. And that doesn't mean just promoting American businesses. It also means just making sure American businesses find out about opportunities in Thailand. Thai companies look at opportunities to invest in the United States. And also, we just try to make the economic environment in Thailand better for business. Because I would always say, look, I'm not trying to promote American businesses. If the economy is more free market capitalism, more open, American businesses will succeed. So I don't need to specifically help them per se. I just want to make the environment better so then they can succeed. And so I actually created 4 different teams, one in tech, one in health and pharma, one in defense and aerospace, and one in infrastructure, where then every week I would have a total interagency group of people that could be relevant to those areas, updating me on every single thing we're doing to help sort of American businesses and potential deals. And that worked really well. And that foundation, I believe, is still continuing after my departure, but requires a longer lead time. So hopefully that'll bear more fruit in the coming years.
Very interesting. It was obviously a challenging period with COVID as well, preventing as much engagement as you would have liked. You talked about the need to bring about a strategic re-engagement with Thailand, and Thailand is historically is unique in the region. It was never colonized. In the 19th century, Thailand spent a lot of time and invested a lot of capital in keeping both France and the United Kingdom at arm's length. And you talked about the Thai-Chinese relationship. There's some sense among some observers here in Washington and elsewhere that Bangkok is continually doing the same, that it's a U.S. treaty ally, but it's purchasing these submarines, as you mentioned in your remarks. What's your sense of how Thailand's handling the great power competition?
Ken, I mean, you're exactly right. Thailand has a history of balancing great powers, and that practice continues to the day. But how can we blame them when we sort of pushed them away in 2014? So I think, as I would always tell to my Thai interlocutors, we're not telling that you have to choose between us and China. We want to demonstrate to you that we are the better friend to Thailand. And so I'd use that as an opportunity to explain the unfriendly things that China's doing around their borders. The Mekong River was actually a great example for that, where I think all the countries now have come to appreciate the real disadvantages of the damming on the Mekong that China's been doing with 11 upstream dams that essentially are controlling the water flow in the Mekong. But I think we need to first make sure that we really show Thailand that we have its back and that we really are committed to it, and that we will send high-level people to important engagements with Thailand, and that we will continue the interactions that we have and strengthen them and strengthen the military cooperation. Then maybe we'd be in a position to encourage them to start moving away from China to some degree. But we do need to be sympathetic to their location in the world. I mean, China's right there. We're a long way away. And I mean, even Vietnam has that same challenge as well, although they sometimes lean a little bit more out than Thailand does. But it's a challenging circumstance to be in when you're still wondering, is the U.S. really committed or not? And that's why we really need to show that we're really committed.
And look, and in the interim national security guidelines from the Biden administration, there was a noticeable silence about Taiwan's role as a
They weren't mentioned, Ken. I mean, Thailand was not listed. They listed the allies and even the partners like Vietnam and Singapore, but they didn't mention Thailand, which is one of the oldest strategic allies in the region. So yes, that was not unnoticed in Bangkok. Where
you currently live. Let me. What's your sense as to why Thailand wasn't listed? Do you have an educated guess on that?
I mean, I think there's two aspects to it. One is that, as I said, so much of what goes on in Thailand that's actually of critical importance, people that don't deal with it on a day-to-day basis actually don't know about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, which is kind of, when one is in government, which I had for the first time, you see the massive amount of information flows, and people are overloaded with information. So I think a lot of that stuff that's critically important just doesn't rise to the level of even very senior people in the government if they're not focusing on Thailand. They still should know about it, but I mean, I think there is a certain amount of that. I do also think that people of aftermath of the 2014 coup is some people are still questioning the nature of the governmental system in Thailand and are worried that they don't look as much like us as we would like. And that's something that I think is very important for people to deal with and understand, that not every country pursues democracy in the same way. And other countries have different types of governmental systems that include monarchies and others, and we need to be understanding of that to some degree.
And let me ask you, it touches on another point about the Biden administration's policies. With the president's heavy focus on rallying democracies against authoritarianism, do you think that that's helpful in Asia? Are there limits to that policy? And what challenges does it pose for Thailand in particular and for the ASEAN countries more generally?
Yeah, I think you're right, Ken. That is a challenging way of looking at the world. And I'm a firm believer in the strengths and benefits of democracy. I mean, I think it definitely is the right system, and it would be great if every country had it. But we can't necessarily, choose who we're going to cooperate with solely based upon those metrics. Now, clearly, those metrics are important, and there's, circumstances where countries obviously go too far, and that's what we have to do. We have to change how we deal with them because we're not comfortable. But it's not black and white, and I think, unfortunately, there may be some people in the administration that are looking at it a little bit too black and white at times. But I'm still cautiously optimistic it was more of an overlooking rather than a conscious decision that they don't want to engage. Because we have seen Wendy Sherman go to Thailand recently. I think you are seeing the kind of engagement that should exist, but just it's not as much as it should be.
No, that's very interesting in terms of, because it's interesting that Vietnam would be listed if you're making that distinction and Thailand wouldn't. So it really does. It's very puzzling.
Well, and Thailand notices that quite significantly, and particularly when people criticize, when the U.S. administration criticizes the Thai form of government, but yet is perfectly happy to not criticize the Vietnam form of government, which everyone would acknowledge is much worse than the Thai form of government. I mean, a communist dictatorship fundamentally in Vietnam. So it does not go unnoticed by the Thais in that circumstance.
Now, you talked a bit about the importance of the personal ties with Thailand, and you mentioned that the military attaché at the embassy in Bangkok had these strong personal ties to
right.
the key royal Thai official. There's some sense here, and CSIS did a study a few years back looking at the perception of Thai military officers of the U.S. And there's a significant percentage of Thai military officers who were unaware of the critical support that the U.S. gave Thailand in the critical fight against communism. Is there more that we could be doing to both educate Thai officers and the Thai public at a more strategic level?
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that study, and it definitely doesn't reflect the experiences I had with the senior military leaders. I mean, it is unfortunately aftermath of the 2014 reaction that there was a period of 4 or 5 years where we really didn't have the military officers coming to the U.S. for the training. And where did they go? They went to China instead. And so there's a sort of a gap there that we're now backfilling in terms of people having that training. And I think it generally is the case, you see, particularly in the Army and the Air Force, where our connections are the closest, that the people chosen for senior level commands, and I get the feeling the CIS survey may be broader and may have hit more of the mid-level officers, but definitely the ones chosen for the senior level command are often chosen because they've done U.S. training. They've been in the U.S., they speak English, they have the background, because they really want to use U.S. military doctrine and U.S. military training, and that's what they prefer to use in their armed forces. And so that connection is very deep. But you're right, even in Thailand, I spent a lot of time educating the Thais on how close our working relationship is. And during COVID, the health cooperation was one of the best. I mean, the fact that CDC has been there for, I think, 45 years, and AFRIMS has been there for 60 years. And, the malaria aspect, malaria is pretty bad in Thailand. The fact that, the malaria drugs that are used in northern Thailand have all been developed by the U.S. military in cooperation with the Thai military through the Armed Forces Research Institute of Medical Sciences. So you're right, even in Thailand, they don't appreciate as close of the work that we've done. So we have to both educate both people back in America and also in Thailand.
And is your sense the Chinese are they doing a better job than we are? What's the sort of secret sauce of their engagement aside from the obvious things that...
I think it's more of the obvious things. The secret sauce of their engagement is closeness and size. And size meaning also lots of money. I mean, they have lots of companies that are there to do business in Thailand, some with state support, which obviously gives them certain advantages, but some just because they're nearby and it's their backyard. And so I think in talking to Thai businessmen. Actually, a very good example. I was up in Chiang Mai at one point in time, and I was talking to the tourism people up in Chiang Mai, which were hurting pretty badly because there was no tourism in Thailand in 2020. But in the last 5 years, it's been the Chinese tourists that have just been bringing all the money into Thailand, particularly northern Thailand, where they hadn't been much before. And I asked them, so what is your impression of like Western tourists versus Chinese tourists? Which would you rather make money from? And 201, we would much rather have the Western or the American tourists. Much better for us. I mean, we make more money from them in most circumstances. They spend more per person. Just a better business model for us. But they're just not here as much. I mean, the Chinese are coming in large quantities, and they're there. And that's kind of the challenge that we have, is it's sort of a closeness and a size that requires us to really push economically and otherwise to make sure we have a similar sort of impact. But it's tough because it's a long way away, and for us it's a country that doesn't have an inherent reason we're not next to it or something, while China's backdoor.
And China views these tourists also as a just geostrategic asset. I mean, they've threatened other countries. They've cut back tourism in other countries when they feel that other countries are moving to closer alignment with us. Which is interesting because one would think that other countries would look at that and say, look, we really don't want ourselves to be dependent upon Chinese tourists. And Thailand has that view. And actually, I was down in Phuket also talking to the Phuket Hotel Association about how during COVID it'd be a good time to try to restructure towards higher dollar tourism so you're not so dependent upon the Chinese mass market tourism. And all of them said the right things, that they think they want to do that. But if that mass market tourism comes back, it's going to be hard to resist. And so it's a challenge, but you're right. Sometimes they don't appreciate that also makes them more dependent. And if China wants to turn that tap off, as they've done in Korea and Japan before, that can be quite powerful. Let me shift gears and ask you about the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and the question of ASEAN centrality. That as the strategy has developed, as it goes through its various iterations, both here in the U.S., among our Quad partners, Australia, India, Japan, there is, and particularly here in the United States, there's been some significant discussion about the role of ASEAN centrality as opposed to the emergence of the Quad as a more important engagement coordination mechanism. Do you see a tension between ASEAN centrality and I think there's great sensitivity in the ASEAN countries to the notion that we in the U.S. might make the Quad sort of more central to the Indo-Pacific strategy, certainly more central than the ASEAN countries are. And there's also a sense here that the ASEAN countries, in part because of their geographic location, are trying to find a middle road between us and China. Most of the ASEAN countries, Vietnam really being the very, very clear distinction. And so, which makes it difficult to pursue a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in some sense, and was wondering what your take on that is, given the unique role you played.
No, that's a very good question, and I think I view it, particularly from U.S. foreign policy aspect, as very complementary, the ASEAN centrality. I mean, ASEAN centrality is to some degree a recognition of just reality, that if one is, and this is sort of as I said in my remarks, Thailand is sort of ground zero for the competition between U.S. and China. And ASEAN is part of that ground zero because ASEAN's right in the middle. And ASEAN are the ones that are not fully committed one way or the other in most circumstances. There's a little bit of balancing going on with everybody. Even Vietnam, I mean, will not do certain things because they're concerned about China's reaction. So as a just statement of fact, ASEAN has to be the center of any Indo-Pacific strategy because that's sort of where the battle for influence is. And I think they recognize that, and that's sort of important to them. But it makes it challenging because, as you say, all of them have a little bit of a tension between what they're going to do. I mean, the Quad is clearly an organization of well, particularly Australia and Japan, but even hopefully India is much more of a close ally and someone that we can really work with, and we know that we're all going to be pushing in the same way. But even that is a real recent phenomenon. I mean, one of the things I did when I first went to Bangkok was to reinvigorate the Quad relationship amongst the ambassadors. And I was told subsequently by the Australian ambassador that, at least as far as Australia viewed it, our sort of Quad stuff in Thailand was the best in the world, sort of one of the better coordinated and vibrant group. But that was only by like June or July of 2020. In January 2020, the Indians were a little bit like they're willing to come to lunch and stuff, but they were not as engaged. The Australians are always friendly, but they were more in the, we sell all this wine and beef to China. We're a little bit concerned. We don't want to do things to annoy them. All that changed in that 6 months when you had the line of actual control dispute in India, where India really woke up and said, okay, yep, we need to start dealing with this situation. And then after Australia called for an independent inquiry on the origin of the virus, and China just decided to throw economic warfare at them, they also came around to the notion that probably makes sense for us to work together on these issues. And so that grouping, I think, will be a very valuable one. I think we do need to be careful to make sure that it doesn't have the negative effect of pushing our ASEAN people away. And I think it shouldn't, because I really think they're complementary. Even geographically, they're complementary. You have the ones in the middle, you have the ones around the side. I mean, it kind of works together very well.
You talked earlier about the essentially the pincer movement around Thailand, where we have heavy Chinese engagement, whether it be economically in Cambodia and Laos. You mentioned the electric grid in Laos. You mentioned the naval base in Cambodia. Wondering what you, and you also mentioned the cooperation just now among our Quad partners. Key to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy has been an understanding that U.S. economic engagement in the region is critical, right. That it's not simply military engagement that matters, that we really need to be on the ground economically. The Trump administration, through the Bipartisan Build Act, really refocused U.S. international economic development activities through the creation of the Development Finance Corporation, right. Creation of all sorts of new tools to allow for investments in places like Thailand and the ASEAN region, also other developing regions of the world as well. And at the same time, there was also a significant number of trilateral economic development engagement activities with the Japanese and also with the Australians, including focus on clean technologies for cities, clean tech, obviously clean networks for right. Infrastructure, undersea cables that weren't compromised by authoritarian regimes, in addition to sort of concrete infrastructure investments. Wondering what your sense was of the reforms. Do they go far enough, and what you were starting to see in Thailand? Yeah,
this was an area, in conjunction with the deal teams that I discussed, I was very focused on trying to, again, help Thailand attract more supply chains as they're moving from China. And that's an area where I think we need to continually increase our support. You've seen a lot of that movement to Vietnam so far, and Thailand really should take advantage of it and attract more of it. And it's something I actually put in economic reform proposals into the Thai government in June of last year, focused essentially on that. Thailand's a great place to do business. How can it attract more supply chains that are relocating out of China? and actually went through and made some very concrete proposals after I drafted an op-ed and got a fair amount of attention. And the Thai government is actually really in the process of implementing a fair number of those proposals. And so that's in process and is sort of a good thing. But one thing that I think we haven't done in the United States that I actually was talking to some people on the Hill about as recently as yesterday is recognizing that in the movement of supply chains, not all supply chains can come back to America. We want definitely the most robust supply chains are ones that only are in America because they're safest. But that's not possible. For those of us that have worked and lived overseas, we realize that. I mean, that's just not going to be the case. So for those supply chains that can't relocate back to America, we should try to have a mechanism to encourage them to relocate to our friends and allies, countries that we're comfortable with that will protect those supply chains and that won't take advantage of them, that won't use it to steal intellectual property or otherwise, take what's there. And Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, those countries would be prime considerations for that particularly are low-cost jurisdictions, but are still friends and allies of the United States. So I think the U.S. government should actually put some money behind a mechanism to encourage people. So let's say you've got a factory in China, have the ability to have, write it all off and get tax deductions and then be able to move it somewhere else. Or if you've got a long-term contract for OEM production in China that'll cost you $50 million to terminate, you have the government support some of that if you move it to a friendly and allied country. So I think that's an area where America could do a little bit more to support not only our friends and allies, but more importantly, to support the robustness and reliability of our global supply chains.
And on that, one of the objections the Trump administration had to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Thailand is not joining, as I think as we all know, was the sense that there was a danger that there was kind of a backdoor for China to take advantage of certain countries in Southeast Asia through strategic investments that would allow Chinese auto parts and other things to enter TPP, effectively bringing China in some sense into TPP because the products would have beneficial tariffs because of the way the countries of origin were labeled. And I'm wondering how you avoid that in terms of trying to reshore manufacturing among our ASEAN partners. Is there a way to do that so you can make sure that it's not a Chinese shell company or there's not a Chinese entity that is behind some of this?
Ken, that is a very good question because it is something that is already happening in Thailand and Vietnam. With the tariffs that have been on China now for a while under the Trump administration, we have seen some of those companies moving in less than transparent and really more artificial ways so they can claim they're exporting from Vietnam or they're exporting from Thailand. So that is a valid concern, and it's something that I think can be dealt with through require of transparency, of ownership, of content requirements and things like that. Because in most cases, I mean, if China really does move the entire factory to Thailand and it's owned by Thai people or whatever, then I don't think we should worry about it as much. But that's not usually what happens. It's usually that it's run by the Chinese, owned by the Chinese, and it's still, they try to skirt the content requirements and do it in a less than transparent way. But it's a valid concern, and it's one that we would need to make sure we monitor if we do put some dollars behind trying to get these supply chains to move.
Let me shift gears and ask you, you talked about religious liberty being some of the work you did on religious liberty in Thailand. It's interesting. The Indonesians also have this tradition of greater religious toleration, greater religious liberty. These are pluralist societies. Right. And I'm wondering, do you see a South Asian model of religious liberty, religious tolerance? Is it fundamentally different than the Western model? Is it similar? What are the reasons for it? It's a fascinating phenomena that really is underappreciated here. And Indonesia obviously offers a model for a
majority Muslim country.
Exactly, that's pluralistic, tolerant. Thailand's different, but do you see?
That's actually very interesting. I hadn't focused on the comparison with Indonesia. Amongst the mainland Southeast Asian countries, and again, I'm not as familiar with the other ones, but clearly in Thailand, and I think this relates to the other surrounding countries to a large degree, Buddhism as a religion, it's almost more of a mindset than a religion in some circumstances, but it's clearly considered a religion and practiced like a religion, is fundamentally a tolerant religion. It's a religion that says, everybody can find their own way, and everybody should live and let live, and it's incredibly tolerant as a religion goes. And I think, at least in Thailand, that fundamentally is the foundation of their religious tolerance, which is as a Buddhist, it's like, if you're not a Buddhist, okay, that's fine. You can be whatever you want to be, as long as you don't interfere with me and my ability to practice my Buddhism. So I think, at least in Thailand and probably in the other surrounding countries where there's significant Buddhist influence, that's probably the case. But the Indonesia example is actually much more fascinating, and I wish I understood it. Unfortunately, I don't. It's something that I may want to learn a little bit more about now, because you're right. If there's more of a model, Philippines is an interesting one. Philippines is primarily Catholic for historical colonial reasons. I don't know whether they have a similar, religious tolerance aspect. But no, it's a very interesting question, Ken. I'll have to learn more.
The rise of radical Islam in the Philippines has been quite stark in certain corners,
right.
And so it's been a geostrategic challenge for us, for the Philippines, to handle in a way that.
Well, those are more down in select small areas, right? It's not sort of in
exactly.
the entire Philippines, which is kind of similar in Thailand. You've got the religious, actually not religious disputes, but more insurrection in the southern provinces where people wish they were part of Malaysia as opposed to Thailand. So you have some of that as well, which is not really religious, but.
Let me. This has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a great deal. Let me ask you, and I'm sure our audience has as well. Let me ask you, the Biden administration is about to nominate someone, rumor has it, for this position. We'll see who it turns out to be. If there's one bit of advice you could give to your successor, what would it be?
I'll give two pieces of advice. One, I wrote a very good exit cable, which would be great if they read and tried to follow through on some of those various things. But
classified or not classified?
I think I had two versions, one classified, one unclassified. But secondly, I would say focus on relationships. I think, in my experience, I implemented a system where when I went into my first meetings, or I went into any meeting, frequently my staff would say, you're meeting the Prime Minister, you've got to ask him this, and this, all these things that we need. I'm like, this is my first meeting. I want to develop a relationship. I want to be a circumstance where he appreciates that I can help him, and then if I need him to help me, he can help me. And it's sort of this worthwhile, sort of mutually beneficial relationship. So I would go into all my meetings and start them off by saying, like, Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister or whatever, I want you to view me, the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. government as your partner in helping develop economic, strategic, military aspects of Thailand. So I want us to work together. How can I help you do that? And I think relationships may be a little bit of a forgotten art in United States diplomacy. I think there's been a long period of time where the United States got accustomed to sort of telling countries what to do. And because those countries didn't have alternatives, and if they behaved badly and we cut them off, that really hurt because they couldn't go somewhere else, they would listen. The world's not like that anymore, Ken. And we need to recognize that. And so, we need our friends and allies to want to work with us, not just to work with us because we tell them to work with us. We want them to want to work with us. It's a much better relationship. So I would encourage people to think about relationships.
Well, thank you very much. Those are very wise words to end with. Ambassador Michael George DeSombre, this has been absolutely fantastic. And looking forward to hearing more of your voice on American foreign policy issues, and also Thailand and ASEAN more broadly in the months and years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ken. Appreciate it.